to another tutorial with me, Nancy Adamek from Lena Patchwork. And today we're going to do curves. A lot of people are really afraid of doing curves on paper shapes, but once we're through this tutorial, you'll be fine. So just bear with me. As usual, we start with preparing our fabric. So what we want to do today is we want to make a Dresden Plate flower to start with. So here I've got a little, well, sort of medium-sized Dresden Plate flower with 6 petals. There you go. Which will then have a central circle applique on top afterwards. So the first thing we need to do is we need to cut our fabrics for the petals. And the easiest way to do this is to have a strip of your fabric and then lay your paper shape on it. You can pin it in place if you want to, using a little pin. And then use your sharp fabric scissors and eyeball a fairly generous seam allowance. Because we're using curves, it's a good idea to have enough seam allowance to make your life quite easy. So I've actually had my fabric doubled up, so I've got 2 pieces here. You can see there's a bit of the selvage on here. But if I lay my paper shape on there, you can see that will be in the seam allowance, so it doesn't really matter. So that's 2 petals in this sort of medium blue. I need another one. So again, pin that on there, fairly central. Use my sharp scissors. And eyeball a generous seam allowance, approximately 3/8 all the way around the paper shape. Now I want to make my flower 2-colored. So I have this light blue. And I've also already cut some patches here in a darker blue. So what I want to do is I actually want to alternate the petals, or the colour of the petals in the flower. So my next step now is to cover my paper shapes with the fabric. So here I have a decent quality cotton thread. You don't want to use really thick basting thread because then you need a big needle to use it as well, and we want to use as fine a needle as we can thread. It just makes our life a bit easier when we're stitching through the paper shapes. So we'll have our fabric shape and we put our petal on top of it. And if you see here, you've got some straight edges and you've got the curved bit. Now when we do Dresden plates, it's really important that we don't fold the fabric over on the base of the petals. So we don't do this. We just fold it up and around the sides and the top, not the bottom. So I'm going to start on this side here by folding the fabric over. And for once I'm allowed to start at the end and not in the middle of a shape. So I start here with a knot and I go through all the layers to the front and come back up again and do a tacking stitch. We're going to do another one. So that's 2. And now I have my corner here, so to speak, where it transitions into the curve. And I try to mark that spot with a little fold like that. I'm just going to put a stitch through that as well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to smooth the fabric over the edges and do a little bit of the edge at a time. Sometimes you create a little fold and sometimes not. The important thing is that you don't have any folded edges right on the curved bit there. So it's not folding it over anymore, it's smoothing it over the edge. And if I put my glasses on, I could see what I'm doing. Ah, that's better. So, got it caught on there. Right, here we go. So you hold the edge and then you smooth the next bit over, and you only sort of do about 1/4 inch at a time. So also your tacking stitches are a lot tighter than I would normally do them on a paper shape. That just ensures that you get a nice smooth edge on the curved bit. This method is the one I always use when I do my petals. Also when I do other curved shapes like circles or so. And once you get the hang of this, it works really well. An alternative way to do it is to gather the fabric on those round curves and then pull it tight. We can give that a go, maybe on the next petal, and see how that works. But in my experience, it distorts the paper shape because you have to pull it quite tight to get a nice edge. So I always say find the method that works best for you, but I recommend this one here. Smooth over, do a stitch. Oops, I've gone around for once. That doesn't matter, don't worry about it when that happens. You don't have to undo that. See, nobody's perfect. And you just keep going. Almost at the other corner of the petal shape in this case. And now we have the remaining straight edge here. So when I know I have got my corner of my paper shape there, I then fold this around and make a neat fold. And now I got that finished. Not in the thread there. I'm just going to stitch across and back to my start point, but I have not folded this base up. I want that extra fabric in the middle so that I can applique my circle to that. So don't be tempted to fold it up. It makes your life more difficult and it creates extra bulk that we don't need. So just cut the end of the thread. And now I need to make 6 more of those. Okay, so now I've done my 6 petals. Now we can sew them together. And we're going to use a matching thread. So I found this blue one, which I think will work really nicely. So I'll need a decent length of that, not too long. You don't want to have your thread longer than about the width of your shoulders, otherwise it gets entangled, or you work the thread too hard and they're more prone to breakages then. These shapes are sewn from the outside towards the middle. So I have to make sure that my shoulders here are nicely defined. I line them up, literally laying the 2 shapes on top of each other, right sides together. And then start sewing on the edge here. I make an extra stitch at the beginning, my anchoring stitch, and then whip stitch along to the bottom. So as you're sewing, you're really only picking up the fabric that is sort of on the edge of, just a bit that's folded over the edge of the paper shape. If you're going too deep, you can feel it when you're catching the paper, so you try to avoid that. You don't need to space your stitches very tightly. If you do a stitch every couple of millimeters or 3 stitches to 1/8 of an inch, that's plenty. You don't need to have them any tighter than you would have them on your sewing machine, for example. And you can give your thread just a little tug as you're tightening the stitches. Now I come here to the end of my paper shape, I can feel it, but I'm going to continue sewing a couple of stitches beyond that, just so that we have a decent middle of the flower. I'm going to do 1 more stitch here, and an extra one, my anchoring stitch, and then stitch in the reverse direction, so just going backwards over the seam again. Couple of stitches to be able to then cast off. So there's that. Done. Tie a fresh knot and line up your next piece. So here I want to alternate the colors, so I'll put this blue one on the light blue, line up my edges nicely and start there. So now we've done our two halves of our flower, and now we sew those two together. So it's the same as usual, right sides together and just do the one side of the seam. And in principle, all the Dresden plates are done in this way. You would always cover the individual petals first and then sew them together like this, and then put the middle of the flower, it's usually a circle, on top of that afterwards. Cast off. One last seam. One of the things I get often asked about the Dresden plates is, do you have the shapes that fit around them so that they can be integrated into a pattern? And the answer to that is no. They are always stitched onto a background. They are always appliqued. There's only very few flowers which are integrated in a bigger layout of paper shapes. So, almost there. But applique sounds, you know, daunting for those of us who haven't done it yet, but it's really not that difficult. And I'll show you how I do it. So, last stitch. Secure the end of my thread. And there is our petals for our Dresden plate, really. So then here is a circle that I've prepared earlier, and we're going to applique that onto the middle. Now sometimes it's a bit difficult to align this circle into the middle here, and I'm terrible for getting it wrong. Okay, so what I do is I take my paper piece and I fold it in half, give it a good crease. So that then helps me to align it on that side. And if you then manage to fold it accurately the other way as well, another crease there. So you have one which aligns across the flower here, and then the other one you can move left to right until that's in the middle of this flower here. So that's okay. And if you're happy with your positioning, hold it down, get some strong pins and pin a few of these sides into place. Best to turn the whole thing and not try and pick it up. Does that all look all right, or has that shifted again? That's shifted a bit. Let's say that's fine. I tack it into place, and I do that because otherwise the thread has a tendency to wrap itself around the pins. Like that, which I find very annoying. Don't think I can take that one out. And as soon as the pins are taken out, everything gets a lot easier. There we go. Cut the tacking thread. So now we're ready to applique this onto the blue. And can you see how this is quite tight with our middle? That's why we didn't fold the bottoms up, because it would have been really difficult to place our circle nicely and have enough fabric to pin things to. So now we need a yellow thread. That one will do nicely. And we'll applique the circle onto the petals. And again, I use a matching thread for the piece I want to applique onto the background. So yellow thread. And a lot of people have asked me, why don't you take the paper out first? Isn't that easier? And I find that it's actually easier to have the paper inside because it gives me a really nice edge to work with. If you have a different applique method that you are familiar with and that works well for you, then by all means use it. But I do it this way. So I pick up a little bit of fabric from the background and then a little bit of fabric from the side in one go. It's a blind stitch or ladder stitch. And then where my thread comes up here, that's exactly the stage where I dive down into the background. I can trim that. So now I've got an awful lot of tacking stitches here on my circle bit, and I can remove those. And I find the easiest is if I simply sort of snip them 4 or 5 times going around, and then just pick them off with a pin. This is what you should do when you are removing the papers. A lot of people say, and then I rip the paper out. And I say, no, you remove the tacking stitches and then you remove the paper. But you don't rip it out. Nothing gets ripped here. And this bit doesn't want to come out. That means there's probably the knot on the other side of the paper piece. And you can just sort of cut that short. So there's our tacking removed from the middle, which means I can now just take the paper out the back. And there's our flower done. So as I said, these flowers will now have to be stitched onto a background piece. And I've prepared a bit of fabric here. There's a green. I'll put this blue flower on there. I think that should be okay. For placement, if you are unsure that it's in the center and you're quite fussy like that, again what you can do is you can just fold the fabric one way, give it a little crease, and then fold it the other way, give it another crease, and then use those creases to align your flower. Now we again have to pin it in place. And to make sure it's nice and flat. If you're in doubt, you can always give it a quick press with the iron. Always use a dry iron, no steam. If you use steam on the paper shapes, it can distort them and it doesn't do them any harm, but it's not very helpful if the paper piece curls up. So now the next step would be to tack around that and then applique around the flower. Now to cast off, I do a series of small stitches on the back through the seam allowance. So this is the applique done. The next step is to take the tacking stitches out. So that's the easy one, so there's my knot. I sort of cut every third one. Roughly, usually does it. And you can just grab them and pull them out. So these are the tacking stitches that held the flower itself in place, not the petals. So we still have those to remove. So to remove the petal pieces, we'll turn the whole thing over. We take our sharp snips and simply cut into the fabric here behind the flower. Just sort of lift it up and snip into it until you can get the tip of the scissors in. And now I cut parallel to the sewn applique line. This doesn't have to be very neat or accurate. We just want to remove the excess fabric behind the flower so that we can get to the paper shapes and the petals. Good, there we go. They are our paper shapes. And now we can remove those. And we do this just like we remove any other paper shape. Rather than ripping the stitches out, we look for our tacking knot, which is there, and then snip the tacking thread in a few other places. On the flowers, it's actually easier to do it on this side here. So if you sort of cut every third or fourth of these, that helps a lot. But please don't cut into the fabric when you do this. This is just to aid us taking the stitches out. That's not so difficult, is it? A lot of people always say that it's so much work to take the tacking stitches out. I don't like the thread basting. And I think, what are they talking about? This is not much work. Probably took less than 2 minutes for this whole thing. Turn it over. and then you take the papers out. If there's a bit of resistance anywhere, then it's probably because we've stitched through the edge of the paper. So if you hold the seam before you pull the paper, that's a good idea. You don't want to damage the seam, pull the stitches apart. It's better to, have a damaged paper shape. That looks good. Yeah, that one is. See, it was stuck there on one little stitch. That's all the paper's gone. Look, flower has relaxed. We can now give this a press, cut it to a perfect square with the ruler, and then add more borders to it or integrate it into a quilt. That's a Dresden plate done. The Dresden plates come in lots of different sizes and shapes. So this is one which has 6 petals, but we also have other ones. Here's another one. Here's another 6 petal one, a smaller one. So this one has a little hexagon in the middle. That is actually sewn in. It's a different one. But you can also have ones which have only 8 petals. So if you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are also Dresden plates with 16 petals or more. 12 is quite common. So it's really important to know what sort of Dresden plate do I need for my project. And unfortunately in books it's not often described very well. A good idea is therefore to measure the size of your Dresden plate across the flower from one side to the other. How big is that? To know how big the flower is, or how big the square is that the flower needs to fit on, and how many petals you need. That's a good way to define a Dresden plate. So this one here is 7 inches across and it has 6 petals. This one here has 8 petals, but it's still 7 inches across. Yeah, the little one here is 6 petals and it's 4 inches on the widest point across the whole flower. So that's those. But then there's other ones, like Dresden plates, but not quite. So this is called a chrysanthemum. So you can see the difference between the Dresden plate and the chrysanthemum is actually that these have pointy petals. But we pretty much work with these in the same way that we do with the Dresden plates. You cover each individual paper shape, you sew them together until you have the petal background, and then you applique the center on top, and then the whole flower gets appliqued onto a background. This one here actually has 16 petals. That's a bit more work than the 6 petal one in comparison, but it looks very nice. So that's Dresden plates, that's outward curves. In our next tutorial we want to talk about inward curves and how to tackle those. So tune back in. Thank you.